So today I'll be sharing two methods that allowed me to achieve amazing Cambridge scores. And these two methods allowed me to absorb a lot of information without spending too much time studying. So without further ado, let's get into the first method, which is to leverage spaced repetition. Now before I tell you how you can leverage it, let me briefly explain what spaced repetition is. So spaced repetition is when you remember a piece of information just at the moment you're about to forget it. And when you do this, you will need a lot of brain power to retrieve that piece of information. And the idea is that the more brain power you have to use to get that piece of information, the stronger that information will be embedded into your brain. And therefore, it will take you longer to forget that piece of information. So let's say you're studying a topic and it takes you 3 days to forget that topic. But by the end of the third day, you come back to that topic and you try to recall what you have learned. Once you have recalled that, it will now take you, for example, a week to forget that information. And if you come back and recall it again by the end of the week, it will now take you 2 weeks to forget the information. So as you can see, the intervals keep increasing and increasing until it is hard-coded into your brain. So how can you leverage this? How can you use this knowledge for your own good? So personally, the way I schedule my own revision is, for example, let's say I have 3 subjects. I have biology, chemistry, and mathematics. So what I do is I study biology for 2 days, and then I move on to chemistry, which I study for 2 days. Then I move on to mathematics for 2 days. And then after mathematics, I come back to biology and repeat the whole cycle again. Now the reason I do this is because by switching between subjects and leaving some time between each subject, you're allowing yourself to forget the piece of information that you learned. So during the next cycle, for the same subject, you can recall what you have learned previously. And this isn't as complicated as it seems at all. It's actually fairly simple. So what I do is, back to my example, I'm taking biology, chemistry, and mathematics. Let's say I finished one cycle and I'm back to biology again. Before I start reviewing any new content, I would immediately open some questions regarding what I have learned in the previous cycle. And then without opening my book or notes, I would try to remember all the information that I learned and answer them. So by doing this, you will have to use a lot of brain power to retrieve the information that you are about to forget. And as I have mentioned before, once you do this, the piece of information will be embedded into your brain, so you will remember it for long periods of time. So to sum it up, spaced repetition is when you try to remember a piece of information just at the moment you're about to forget it. And there are many ways you can implement this into your studies, but the way I do it is I switch between multiple subjects. For example, I do 2 days per subject. And the benefit of this is by the time you get back to the same subject, you've already almost forgotten everything that you studied before. And this is a good thing because you will now have to work and use brain power to retrieve the information again. So the second method that I used to get amazing Cambridge scores was to do more than you read. Now, when it comes to reviewing for your Cambridge exams, the most important thing you can do is to do past papers. Past papers are the biggest tool that you can use to level up your grades. And the amazing thing is, they're available for free online. But how do you actually do them? So let me introduce you to quantity versus quality practice. Now, how most people approach past papers is they push themselves as much as possible to do as many past papers as they can. And the logic that they're using is more past papers equals to better grades. And when they're checking their answers, if they get a question correct, they are happy and they simply move on. And if they get a question wrong, they try to remember the correct answer and then move on. So ultimately, they spend around 80% of their time doing the questions and 20% of their time checking the answers. Now, while this may seem effective, the truth is it's only effective in the short term because it relies on memorization. So if you're using quantity practice, you may find yourself repeating the same mistakes over and over again. So now let me introduce you to quality practice. So when we're approaching past papers, what most people do is they focus on answering the questions. But in quality practice, instead of focusing so much on answering the questions, you should try to shift your focus to correcting your answers. When you're checking your answers, you're giving feedback to yourself and you're identifying your strengths and weaknesses. So receiving feedback on your performance is extremely important. And this feedback can help you decide what topics you should review more and what topics you're already good at. So in quality practice, when you're checking your answers, let's say, for example, you get a question wrong. Instead of simply giving yourself a cross and remembering the right answer, what you should try doing instead is to rewind back in time and remember the thought process that led you to that answer. Remember exactly what you were thinking before that has led you to writing that answer. And once you've remembered the logic that you use, what you must do now is to identify the flaw in that logic. So ask yourself, why is this wrong? Why can't I think like that? And once you've identified the flaw, you must remove the logic that you use completely and replace it with the new logic that leads to the correct answer. And this also applies to when you get a question correct. So when you're checking your answers and you see that you got a question correct, what you should do is rewind back in time, remember the logic that you used that led to that answer. And now instead of identifying the flaw, you should identify the strengths of that logic so that you kind of reinforce it even more. But ultimately, what I'm trying to say is to spend more time checking your answers rather than focusing purely on answering them. The reason why I mentioned about logic is because you know that moment when someone asks you a really easy question and you think to yourself, oh, that's common sense, everyone knows it, I don't even have to think about it. The reason why you don't have to think about it is because inside your brain, you already have a clear and concise logic that leads to that answer. And the logic has already been strengthened so many times that you don't even have to think about it. So back to doing past papers, when you identify the logic, even when you get the questions correct, you're kind of strengthening your brain. So ultimately that question will seem common sense to you and you won't have to think about it. So to sum it up, you must do past papers if you want to get good Cambridge scores. And when you're doing past papers, there are two main approaches. The one that you should try using is quality practice. So instead of spending 80% of your time doing the questions and 20% of your time checking your answers, try to spend around 50% of the time doing your questions and 50% checking. And when you're checking, no matter if you get a question correct or wrong, you should try to rewind back in time and remember the logic that you used to lead to that answer. And if your answer is correct, you should strengthen that logic. And if your answer is wrong, you should find the weakness in that logic and remove it. So those were the two main tips that I wanted to share. You can go try them out, experiment with new things, and have fun.